pleased to introduce again Dr. Grezskowiak, who will be presenting on seizure forecasting from concept to reality. Dr. Grezskowiak?
Well, it is certainly my pleasure to be here today, and I just want to say thank you so much to EF Michigan for hosting me and allowing me to present to you today a little bit about the work that we're doing and the work of the research community on seizure forecasting. And I'll also say at the beginning that I really look forward to your feedback. I'll have my email on the end of the slides. So please do send me an email and let me know if you're interested in learning more about seizure forecasting. So I wanted to take a step back to begin with and start with the goals that I have for today's discussion. The first one is to share with you a little bit about the background on seizure forecasting research, because it goes back a lot further than you may think. And so it's really interesting to see how technology and all of the advancements that we've seen have really been incorporated into seizure forecasting research. So I'll tell you kind of where we've been. And then I also want to share some really exciting projects that are under development and new advancements in the field. And then I think importantly, we also need to discuss how, as the community, seizure forecasting is helpful, but also how there may be limitations to the forecasting devices. And as you consider whether a forecasting device is for you, what factors you need to make that decision and how you make that decision. And as the Epilepsy Foundation, that's really where we can really help companies and researchers understand the needs of the community. And then as a part of that, I'll share a little bit about an update on the Epilepsy Foundation's My Seizure Gauge initiative, which is a multi-year initiative that's really focused on developing a prototype for a minimally invasive product that can forecast seizures. And so given the polling that was done at the beginning, I would say this community is very excited about that prospect. And so I'm excited to share that with you today. So I start with the analogy of the weather, because when I think of forecasting, I think about the weather. And when you think about the weather, there's some people who kind of never listen to the weatherman, he's always wrong. Or there's some people who really want to plan out their day depending on, if it's going to rain or not, right? So if there's, say, an 80% chance that it's going to rain today, you might think, okay, I make sure I grab an umbrella if you're going to go to an outdoor activity. Or if you're just, running into the grocery store, maybe you're like, oh, okay, be prepared, it's going to rain, but I'm not really going to worry about it too much because it's just from my car to the store. But everybody's different and everybody makes decisions for how they're going to plan for the weather accordingly. And so that's really what the forecasting, seizure forecasting is designed to do too, is to give you a probability, a likelihood of a seizure. And when you think about, say, an 80% chance of rain, just as an example, that 80% means that 20% of the time it's likely to not rain, even though there's a likely chance that it will rain. And so there are some instances where you think that, it's likely to happen and won't happen. And when you're talking about seizures, it's really important to understand how that might impact your decision to forecast. The other interesting analogy with forecasting is the advancement of technology, because what's really interesting about weather forecasting is with new technologies in satellite imagery, we've really been able to advance how well we're able to predict the weather based on patterns that emerge from multiple regions. So combining all of that together gives you a fuller picture and able to forecast more accurately. And that's really an exciting forefront of where we're at with seizure gauge prediction. So the first question that I ask myself, and I'm sure a lot of people want to know, is why forecast at all? And I think there's a couple of really important reasons why forecasting is critical for this point in research. And the first one is that you know, a third of people who live with epilepsy do not have control of their seizures. And so the unpredictability of that, of not having control over your seizures impacts your daily life. And we hear that from members of our community who have very frequent seizures, and also even people who have one seizure a year or less, because you might never know when it's going to happen. The second thing is that even for people who have seizure control, they're still at risk for a breakthrough seizure. And so it can always be kind of in the back of your mind that it might happen. And having that unpredictability is a major theme that we've seen as the Epilepsy Foundation as feedback from our community. And what's really interesting is you might think, you know, let's invest all of our money into therapies because ultimately we don't want to have seizures at all. We don't want to have to forecast seizures because we wish there were no seizures. The reality is that despite the fact that there have been over a dozen new therapies since the 90s, these numbers haven't changed. So even though there have been multiple things entering the market, a third of people in the 90s did not have seizure control. And today, unfortunately, that number is almost equal. And so there's still a large need in the community to have more control over when a seizure is going to happen and understanding that to plan out how you might plan your day or impact your activity. And so when we start to think about seizure forecasting, I broke it down here into 4 stages as a way to think about where we've been and where we are. And so I start with step 1, which is actually taking a step back from prediction and making sure that we can accurately detect seizures. And the reason we need to accurately detect seizures is so that when we predict seizures, we can understand exactly when they're happening and validate a seizure forecasting tool. So there's a wide range of different kinds of seizure detection that I'll briefly walk through, which includes very invasive devices that require brain surgery to less invasive devices like inpatient procedures, as well as non-invasive devices like wearables and also seizure diaries. So once we have accurate seizure detection, which I'll talk about coming up, we also need to develop algorithms to identify patterns of predictions. And these algorithms are basically these math equations that incorporate many different kinds of considerations and factor them for an individual to give them a prediction, a likelihood, a range of likelihood of seizure. So that can be incorporating different components that you might think about when you think about having a seizure, like the type of seizure that it is. Also, if you have particular triggers that you know, or some people can actually feel seizures coming on before they do. And then also what's going on in your environment. So there's some research that actually shows that even air humidity can impact seizure frequency. So once you have developed an algorithm, you actually have to then go and make sure that it works on data sets that you know are accurate for seizure detection. So you want to validate the algorithm in a study and show that your algorithm is accurate at not only detecting seizures, but that period before you actually have a seizure. And I'll show you some data from some researchers who have realized that and are continuing to iterate and make that better. And then finally, the end goal is really a tool that can be developed for widespread use by the community. And while it might seem very straightforward and linear in this slide, I can guarantee you that there are many, many paths and many ways that engineers and researchers have developed different methods to get to these points. And so going from step 3 to step 4 even is very challenging because people have different kinds of seizures, different severity of seizures. And so it's really important to understand that at least initially, a tool like this is going to be built for a specific subset and then get broader as we learn more and more about seizure detection. So let's start with seizure detection. A lot of seizures manifest through a range of sensations. They can be behaviors or movements. You may or may not lose consciousness. And importantly, they also differ even from seizure to seizure in severity and then frequency. And so when we start to think about seizure detection, we want to accurately detect seizures for data sets that we're going to use to forecast seizures down the road. So to do that, there's several more than what I have listed here. I just threw up a couple of examples of ways that we currently detect seizures. The first one is a seizure diary. And that can be something like, even just from a piece of paper, you write down your seizure counts and your frequencies, and you take that when you go to your doctor and you show them, and then that kind of is how they assess information and provide you information about your epilepsy. There's also a more invasive way. There's also, applications on your phone. The Epilepsy Foundation has my seizure diary. So you can also record seizures on your phone as well. And there's many other apps that you can download to do that. There is also less invasive EEGs and then intracranial EEGs, where they actually will implant a device into the brain, and that can store information, EEG information from there. And so this is not an exhaustive list, as I mentioned, but just a way to say there are different modes of seizure detection. And unfortunately, all seizure detection is not created equal. And we have to think about how we get accurate seizure counts. And so one of the really interesting things that people have studied is, what are accurate ways of measuring seizures? And what's really interesting is, if you look at clinically reported seizures and seizures reported from a person with epilepsy, you see that they're able to count seizures. Some people are able to accurately count seizures. But when we look at the intracranial EEG data, we see, like, for example, patient 1 had on average, about a little over 5 seizures per month as reported. But when we looked at the EEG data, they actually had 14 seizures. And so there was a difference of seizures that weren't actually captured by the seizure diary, which can be for a lot of reasons. And some people have seizures and they are unaware that they're having seizures. And so it just leads to an inability to accurately count the number of seizures that we have. There's also people who unfortunately are under the impression that they have seizure freedom. And then when they go look at their IEG data, they see that they actually don't have seizures, or that they do have seizures. For example, this patient has reported 0 seizures, but actually had, over the course of these monthly EEG readings, 126 seizures on average. And so this just goes to show that there are different ways to collect this data, and the way we collect the data is going to determine how well we can accurately predict. And what's really cool is people have been noticing these patterns for a really long time. So these 2 graphs here are taken from a paper that was published in 1938. And what they showed were these patterns, both on a daily basis and when they looked at over the course of a few months, different patterns that corresponded to seizure frequency. So if you look at the first graph over here, you'll see that the seizures were very common. So you're looking at time of day versus number of seizures. And this is actually from a residential facility with hundreds of patients. So that's why the seizure counts are really high. But what's interesting is they have, they clearly show that, when patients wake up early in the morning, they see seizures. When they're having about lunchtime, there's also seizures shown here. And then during bedtime, and then, as they continue to go up during sleep. So you can kind of start to see this pattern arising here if you just kind of draw a line over where these seizures are, so that you can really get a better sense of, okay, this is a time when people are more prone to having seizures in this facility. And this was detected by the physicians at the residential facility. And when we look at it over the course of weeks, what we notice is that individual people, as shown here by these numbers, have different patterns of seizures. So for example, this individual had seizures every few months, And it was very regular in that they had these kind of clusters here over the course of a few months. Whereas this individual had a very different pattern, right? And then same for this individual. And then this one had one every about 2 weeks. But the patterns are actually pretty predictable when you look at them on an individual basis. And this was the first kind of suggestion that there are rhythms of seizure recurrence. And so while seizure detection is really important, that next step is the algorithm development. So how are we going to go from detecting seizures to developing a seizure forecast through prediction methods? And so as I showed you on the previous slide, the most important component is really having the ability to look at an individual and say to that individual, we've identified what your pattern is. And so these pattern predictions happen through the data fed through the intracranial EEG. And so what happens is when the device is implanted, they monitor for the IEA. And then what ends up happening is then they can use the algorithms that they develop to eventually predict whether or not you're in what probability range you're in to have a seizure. And so what they've noticed when they do these studies through the EEG data is that they can use past seizures, as noted in this graph here, to actually develop the forecasting models. And so you'll notice that these seizures actually have these predictable patterns along with the IEA, or interictal epileptiform activity. So they actually can break this down daily and also over multiple days, which is what is shown here. And if you look just within a certain time frame, you can start to see that as well, that there's these rhythmic valleys and peaks that identify times when people are likely to have seizures. And you can actually train data such that you can figure out, okay, what was happening in the data sets that was unique during these times of seizures. And so you'll notice that their forecasting device actually shows here that there was a seizure and that they could accurately predict that that seizure occurred. Now, it doesn't happen all the time, right? So there are instances where people may have a seizure and it was not predicted. And that is something that the community is going to have to really provide feedback for, so that device manufacturers and companies and researchers can really incorporate what the community needs in terms of making sure that there are times when, to minimize the times where there are predictions or lack of predictions that are not matched up with the likelihood of a seizure. But the other cool thing about some models is they can actually go down to the hour. And there's a really exciting new project that actually was just recently published that showed you may be able to predict seizures within an hour in order to just to inform you of activity that you might want to participate in over that time period. So going back to 2013 and how this all occurred, how the development of these algorithms happened, the NeuroVista device was a product that's connected EEG readings, and the NeuroVista actually developed a seizure warning system. So the way this works is they have an implanted system here, and then there's a device that gets put on your chest. This is just a monitoring unit here. And then they gave you this little device which looks like a beeper. And the beeper has different lights on it to indicate times of seizure safe times or seizure prone times. So if the light is blue, that means that there's a low likelihood that you're going to have a seizure. If it's gray or white, that means that it's moderate, you have a moderate risk, or it cannot actually determine your risk. And if you have a red light, that would indicate this alarm period where it would actually predict that you will have a seizure. And so the first step with any of this is to validate it, right? So they did the clinical trial here, which the information is listed there. And what was really amazing was it was a study that didn't have a lot of people in it. So I think in the paper published here, there was 15 people in the study, and they followed them over many months. But what's cool is they actually showed 100% accuracy in algorithms, and I'll show you that data on the next slide. However, there were a couple of key insights and learnings that we can take away from this, because ultimately the device was not successful in that, you know, it didn't pan out to be something that the community widespread used. And there's a few reasons why that is. And the first one is that the algorithms that they used to develop this seizure forecast tool, seizure warning system, needed to be developed over longer periods of time. So the study showed 3 months, and they actually needed to really test it for much, much longer. And, you know, now we can actually get data going back like 10 years from the same person. And so at this time, this was a very, very cool finding. But as we now have collected much, much more data, we realize that the algorithms that are developed need to include many years of data in order for it to accurately predict seizures. The other key learning from the NeuroVista study was that you cannot just take, you know, 15 patients and develop an algorithm and then apply that, you know, algorithm that works for those patients to everyone. So what that means is each individual patient is going to need a personalized approach when it comes to developing an algorithm for them. And that was a key insight because, you know, people have different seizure patterns, and different triggers, and, you know, many things that get incorporated into when a seizure is going to happen. So it's really important that the patterns that are collected and learned from over time are specific to that individual. So this is an example of what one patient saw over the course of a few days. So you'll notice that the lights kind of indicate that beeper light that I was mentioning. So on this patient's beeper, they're seeing blue, you know, keep going. This is like over the course of their day. They're seeing blue, and then they see white, which indicates a moderate likelihood, and then it goes back to blue, and they're, you know, good for that day. And then the next day, the same thing happens. And then they get to this day, and they get this area of red where they actually had a seizure. And so the device was able to tell them that they were going to have a seizure, and they did have a seizure. And then the next day, it gives them the prediction again, no seizures, no seizures. And then if you look at July 11th, it actually tells you this red period where they were likely to have a seizure, but they did not have a seizure. And you see that a few more times. So you'll notice that that also happened 2 days later, and then it happened about 4 days later, and then 2 days later, and then the next day. And then actually this day, they showed, you know, 2 seizures, which did occur, and they were able to predict that it occurred, which means that if you look at all of this data together, you'll see that there were 3 instances where seizures occurred. And in all 3 instances, the device was able to tell them that the seizure was likely to occur. Now, the device also told them that there had seizures likely to occur when they didn't in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the instances. And so this is something, again, where an individual would want to understand their own needs about a seizure forecasting tool in order to make the decision as to whether this would be something that is useful for them. So the reason why we now have a lot of data on EEG readings, intracranial EEG readings, is because in 2014, the FDA approved some devices that are actually used to treat epilepsy called neurostimulators. And these actually also store the epileptiform activity when they're implanted. And so what that means is not only can you use things like the NeuroVista device, but now things that actually are used to treat epilepsy, we can continue to monitor through IEEG readings. So that includes the NeuroPace RNS system, and then I'm showing also the Medtronic RCS. And what's interesting is we have now thousands of of hours of EEG readings for thousands of patients. And so this is really a great data set to actually learn from in terms of making sure that we can go back in and, you know, retrospectively use that data set to predict seizures in those patients. And the other really exciting concept is there's now even less invasive EEG recording devices, including some that are subscalp. And so this doesn't require a brain surgery. It's a inpatient procedure where a device gets implanted just under the scalp, like maybe behind the ear. And there's two companies that are working on this that work with our My Seizure Gauge team. So one of them is the UNEEG subscalp, and then the other is Epiminder. And so these two are also options for recording devices. And as I'll share with you, our My Seizure Gauge team has been using these devices to monitor seizures so that they can understand that they can do that first step, which is seizure detection for the algorithm development. So I wanted to explain a little bit about where we are with the My Seizure Gauge initiative because the Epilepsy Foundation Innovation Institute has been working on this problem for a few years now. And the Innovation Institute really first, the way we kind of came into this project was through a survey that was conducted for people with epilepsy and caregivers. And it was basically asking the question of what does the community need? Tell us what your key areas are where we can provide insights and help. And so we conducted the survey and got feedback from the community. And then we had to take that back to the experts and to patients and to really bring everyone together and convene a workshop where we could discuss what is the state of science on these topics and where can we make the most impact. And so we aim to address an unmet need, which is how we got to the My Seizure Gauge initiative. Ultimately, the Epilepsy Foundation wanted to fund a solution. So we funded a multidisciplinary team. It's a global team that it receives up to $1 million a year for a few years, really focused, laser focused on this problem of seizure unpredictability. And because we're the Epilepsy Foundation, we can continue to provide insights through our connections to our community and ensure that the devices and the research that's being done is conducted for the community and with the community in mind. So in 2016, we launched the survey. We had over 1,000 individuals participate. And you'll notice that you can see there was many ages. The distribution spanned very nicely across many age types, and also importantly, across many different kinds of seizure frequency. And so there were several, so there's a very nice mixture of people who had seizures, you know, it had been years since they've had seizures and they still participated in this survey versus people who had seizures every day. And then there's also a very diverse range of diagnoses of people who participated in this survey. So I think it nicely captured our community and how we can, so the information that we get from it can nicely tell us what areas specifically does the community need additional support with. So what we found was that the #1 response, the people who responded that they were most strongly agreed with the fact that this is impacting their life is this unpredictability range right here. And that's even when you break it down by seizure frequency. You'll see that unpredictability and not knowing whether you're going to have a seizure is really difficult to, you know, it impacts your daily life the most. So given that was 2016, I generated this timeline to kind of bring you up to speed onto where things are now. So 2016, we found that data in our survey. Then in 2017, we convened the workshop that I mentioned, bringing together experts bringing together patients, having a discussion about where the science is and what the need in the community is. And then in 2018, we put out a request for proposals. So we put out there that, we were seeking grant proposals. And the idea was that we would get projects that could pair this longitudinal EEG readings with other kinds of measurements. So going back to that first poll question about would you wear a device that, you could put on your wrist or that you could put somewhere else that isn't invasive, and everybody said they would wear it. I mean, that's really why we put that into our RFP, is because we knew that as we think about, the development of all these exciting technologies, are there ways and biosensors that will be developed, within the next few years that can provide insights into these new relationships between the brain and the non-invasive or peripheral readouts. So we read through all of the proposals and we evaluated all of them, and then we ended up awarding my seizure gauge team the $3 million, which goes to tracking many different factors, including behavior, environment, physiology, along with an implanted intracranial EEG or a subscalp EEG to detect seizures. And then in the year one of the grant, we basically spent the whole year just looking at the preferences of the users to find out what do people like about particular devices versus others, and which ones provide the highest data quality. So we can make sure that we zero in on exactly the right product for the community in order to just even detect the seizures to develop the forecasting device. I think one thing that is really key is that as we think about data, we think about data integrity, data quality. We need to make sure that the data that we're getting in is really accurate and is really useful in the way that we can incorporate it with other data sets so that we can make those predictions and incorporate additional peripheral measurements. So right now, this is a bit lagging due to COVID. We're in our current year of grant year two. And that is because as many people have experienced with COVID, some of the hospitals have, stopped doing implantations for the EEG devices, understandably because, the hospital capacities were very limited. And so because of that, the studies get delayed a little bit, which happened with a lot of different scientific fields. But now that things have continued to start opening back up, and we can move forward into year three, which is focused on now that we have the data, now that we all agree it's very high quality data and it's complete readings and it has great data qualities, we really wanted to make this a tool for the community. And when I say community, I mean a bigger community. So not just even epilepsy researchers, but computer scientists and software engineers and people that can take this data and download it and mine it and figure out these are the patterns that I observed through looking at this data. So we wanted to make this data universally available for research purposes. And so that's really one of the things that I think the foundation brings to the table in this sense, is that we really wanted to make sure that it's available for everybody. So this crowdsourcing approach allows anyone to go to epilepsyecosystem.org and create a registration and download the data so that you can work with it. And really, even though that data is all publicly available, our team, which is a global team, are working on their own algorithms. And so they're incorporating wearables, incorporating the mobile apps, as well as clinical EEG data sets. And what they're doing is they're looking at patient specific, so this is really at an individual level, risk factors, and sharing that information back with the person. So they undergo, their own specific algorithms and machine learning tools. And that is what ultimately gives you the seizure likelihood or seizure forecasting tool. So this team is made up of people from all over the globe, including right here in the US, in Rochester, Minnesota at the Mayo Clinic. We also have a research team in King's College London and the University of Melbourne in Australia, as well as Seizure Medical, which is a startup in Australia. And really the goal for this team was set to develop a prototype for a seizure forecasting device within 3 years that is minimally invasive. And that is a very lofty goal. And I'm happy to report, though, that the team that we chose is really, they're thought leaders in this field. And they have just made a lot of strides, even through COVID, to really be able to understand and develop something that can be tested now and validated in this second to last year of the grant. And then, as I mentioned before, the second goal is really to make the data sets available to the research community and to accelerate the progress of the data sets. So that was also a condition of the grant. And what's really exciting now as we start to think about all the new technologies, not even just in epilepsy, but just with Fitbit and Apple Watch, and within epilepsy, Empatica and Epilogue and Biteflies. There's so many different kinds of sensors, biosensors that are in development, and it's a really great time to be researching this particular data set, because everyone is really laser focused on not only figuring out what the right detection methods are, but what they're going to do with that detection is really allow to really give you back that predictability of saying, I understand that this is a seizure prone time for you, and then you can use that information to make decisions about your day. And so I think this list will grow. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but I just listed a couple of the different devices that are under development that are really minimally invasive, but may be able to tell us a lot about likelihood of seizures. Even something as simple as a Fitbit, which kind of measures your heart rate and your steps, really might be able to detect or forecast seizures. And the other thing that I wanted to just touch on briefly is where the possibility is. If I put on my kind of science fiction hat and think about, where is the field going to be in years down the line? I think one thing that's really exciting that the research field in general has been really excited about is the non-invasive wearables with the biosensors. And that's things, one of the really exciting advancements has been continuous blood glucose monitoring. So that's when an individual wears a patch on their arm and they basically just continue to monitor their glucose levels. So it's useful for people who have diabetes, and they can just check and see what their blood sugar is right on their phone. And that allows them to plan out information around meals or exercise or any kind of activities. And what's really cool about that is it incorporates a component of your biology that tells you actionable information. And so if you think about something like a crazy concept, right? Like, what if your sweat had a particular chemical in it that could be detected through a patch on your arm, and it could, you could have continuous monitoring of that, and it could give you, a reading on your phone. I mean, these are the kinds of things that I think as we continue to appreciate the advancements that get made with looking at biomarkers and looking at what are the engineering capabilities of these really tiny computers that you can now stick right on your arm. The possibilities are really only what we can think of. And so I think there's some really exciting things on the horizon. And that's just one example of where could we be if we all continue to think about these problems. The other a really important component of seizure forecasting is artificial intelligence, or AI. And the reason why is because this can really revolutionize not only prediction of seizures, but detection of seizures, and actually make them more accurate than even, your doctor reading the EEG. So it's really a very exciting possibility. And when we think about seizure detection and prediction, the thing about the artificial intelligence and the computer learning, machine learning, deep learning is that these computers have the ability to see things that even the human eye cannot see. These very, very subtle changes and features that can contribute to signals that we don't even understand, but the computer understands. And the reason this happens is because we can enter more and more data and get more and more signals back out. So that is to say, the more data we enter, the more signals the artificial intelligence has to read and make predictions and decisions about what is most important and what are the biggest factors that contribute to seizures in order to make those predictions. I already mentioned this in the beginning, but other things contribute that we might not even be measuring for, right? Like the environmental factors, the humidity or air pressure in your region, for example. But then there's also really important limitations on that. And I think this is really important to think about when we think about health equity, because the data that we train is the data that we are going to, that the artificial intelligence learns with. And so if we take a subset of patients that are all very similar and are all, have these focal seizures that are, very regular, how the artificial intelligence is going to learn is really important, that it's going to be limited to understanding that particular subset really well. And so what we need to do is think about how to continue to broaden the spectrum of training data sets so that we can get a critical mass of data. And that might be a huge mass of data collection, but that's what's needed in order for this to be widely useful. At the Epilepsy Foundation, we like to use this concept of wisdom of the crowd, because as we continue, we get inquiries from people who have all different kinds of epilepsies, and each person with epilepsy has such an individual journey that if we continue to combine all of the journeys together, that's really what's going to tell us the picture of epilepsy in general. And so that goes back to the point about making sure that data is open access. So when we started the Seizure Gauge initiative, we made sure that this data would be democratized. And what that means is everyone can mine this data. We're going to get the data sets that are useful to the widest range of people. And as I mentioned, this website is live now. It's on epilepsyecosystem.org. And you can register and download data sets and start to play with it and train your own data if you would wish to. So, okay, that's kind of where we've been. And we wanted to kind of stop and take a pause and say, where are we now? So we've conducted a survey in 2016. We conducted a new one just this year. It closed a few months ago, where we got just under 1,000 people to participate. And we kind of asked the questions that have advanced as the field has advanced. So I'm showing you here, and again, this is unpublished data, so it's in its crude form, I would say. But what you can appreciate is that we have a similar level, and I won't show all of the detail, but we have a similar level of representation in this survey as well, in that we have people who have multiple seizures a day, all the way down to people who were seizure-free for more than 2 years, who have participated in this survey. And what was important to us was to understand a few things about what the community needs from a seizure gauge tool or a forecasting tool. So we asked the question, if we could predict you or your loved one's seizures in advance, how far would you need to be alerted to alter your plans or to incorporate this seizure forecast into your day? And what's interesting is a lot of people said within 24 hours, which, as I mentioned in the beginning, there was that brand new advancement that showed you can predict seizures within an hour that they're going to happen. And, you know, a lot of people actually just want to know, you know, tomorrow, what is my schedule going to look like? And so that's why it's so important to continue to get feedback from, you know, people who need the device in order to understand, in order to make it, you know, useful for them. So the next question that we asked, and again, just asked, was if you or your loved one have not had a seizure on a day where the device said you would have a high chance of a seizure. So essentially, it's, you know, the analogous forecast model of this would be the device, you know, that 80% chance of rain, and then you didn't have a seizure, would you keep using it? And actually, a lot of people said they would still continue to use it, which is consistent with what we saw in the NeuroVista study, right? Where people, you know, he had those 3 seizures, but he also had, you know, 5 other instances where it predicted he would have a seizure, but he didn't have a seizure, yet they continued to still use the device. And then we asked the reciprocal too, which is if the device said that you had a low chance of having a seizure, but you did have a seizure, would you keep using it? And more people were unlikely to continue using it, but still a wide variety of very likely and likely. So, you know, I think it goes back to the question of, you know, if you give multiple chances for the device to work, you can, you know, decide for yourself over time if it continues to provide you with accurate information or not, then that'll really tell you if it's useful for you. And so again, going back to the considerations that each individual person will really need to consider when they decide if a forecasting tool would be right for them is, first of all, to get that feedback from the community. So what's interesting is some people with epilepsy can actually predict their own seizures, or they have known triggers. And so it's obvious to them when they're going to have a seizure. So this device might not be very useful for them. That's feedback that we've gotten from this survey. And there are, I've included on the right-hand side here, features of seizure prediction. So there's 10 different top answers there of the way people predict that they're going to have seizures themselves, where they know that that's what's coming for them. And then there's also just this necessity for continuous feedback on the accuracy of the product. So it's almost like when you, you know, maybe this is old, but you have, you know, the Pandora radio, right? And when you choose a station, like, I don't know if you like a particular kind of music and you choose an artist, you predict kind of, or you get to say like yes or no, right? You get a simple thumbs up or thumbs down if you like the artist or not. So if there's something like that where you can continuously give feedback and say like, this is working for me or this is not working for me, that also is data and information that the research community can use to improve the algorithms. And so that goes back to the case of how there needs to be this personalization of these data sets. There's no way that we can take the data from a subset of people and apply it to everyone. It's going to have to be, you know, people giving their information, their data sets, their seizure data to understand and predict their particular patterns of seizure detection. And the other thing that we need to consider are things that are really going to be unique to each individual person. So that's things like how accurate the prediction tool is. What does a false positive or a negative mean to you? And that's a question that each individual person has to answer. When we posed this question to our community, some of the feedback we got was, I don't want to have a seizure forecast device because, you know, it's going to cause me anxiety on days when I have, high likelihood of seizures. And, that might even potentially trigger a seizure. So it's very personal decision. And we need to make sure that whoever it's right for, that the tools are being developed for them. So that's just to say, does knowing a seizure is coming cause more harm than good? Every person has to decide what's useful for them. And importantly, these tools have really been tested and validated mostly for focal seizures. And so that's a severe limitation of our studies today, which is, the neurostimulator devices are implanted into people who have focal seizures. And so that's majority of the seizures that we detect through those devices. And I showed, finally, I'm showing on the right-hand side here, this table, which shows the performance of the NeuroVista device. And I put this at the end because it really does show you a lot of information about different people and their preferences, even in this one little table. So what you'll notice is when they took the data sets and they learned and trained their data, and then they applied it to the people in the study, you'll notice that the device was very good most of the time at predicting when a person was in a high likelihood seizure event. So you can see that along this side here. But low likelihood, right? When it says not enabled, that means it wasn't able to tell them that. And so what that means is that, the device for some people is telling them that they're usually at a high likelihood of having a seizure, which really isn't a useful tool for them and isn't likely to help them plan their day or activities. Versus if we look down here at this patient right here, this person had 3 instances where they had a high chance of a seizure, and they spent 88% of their time in the low seizure mode. Okay, and then they actually did detect only 3 seizures, so 100% sensitivity. And when you read this paper, this individual patient actually was able to use this to stop taking seizure medication because it was so regular, and they knew exactly when to take their seizure medication based on their forecast. So it is to say that not that it's impossible, but that it needs to work for every individual case, which is unique. So we also asked in our survey, because we were really interested in understanding how people viewed seizure safe time information versus times where you were more likely to have a seizure. And then, that gives us the question of what can we learn from seizure safe times? And what's interesting is the community, so when we asked this question, which is, would a device be more useful to you to tell you when you were more likely to have a seizure, or if you were kind of in a seizure safe zone, for example. And most people said that both times were equally important, but a lot of people said that it was really important to them to have an understanding of seizure prone times. And one of the interesting things that we took away from that is maybe there are real, low hanging fruit or things that we can understand very clearly from data where we have information on seizure safe times. So are there physiological differences that can be studied over the many, many thousands of hours we have where people are in seizure safe times or times where there's low likelihood of seizures? And can we use those predictions actually to reproduce these times in a person's journey here? And so that's just an example of the kinds of ways that we try to think about the data from all angles in order to get a really good sense of what do we need to actually achieve the ability to predict seizures in a meaningful way. And I leave you with this last slide, which is to continue to expect interest on this from the research community. This is a graph here which shows you papers published on seizure forecasting over time. So what you'll notice is that as technology and computers and everything have evolved, this graph looks eerily similar to like how technology has evolved, which is really this exponential growth here, where now there's, you know, over 200 papers being published every single year on seizure forecasting. So there's a lot of interest in this in the research community, and there's a lot of potential and exciting things on the horizon. And so I hope to be back next year and report back additional insights that we've learned over the past year, as I think there's going to be really, really exciting progress to come. So with that, I would just like to leave my contact information. Please feel free to email me if you can figure out how to write down all those letters. But I'm happy to take questions and feedback, and look forward to any questions you have tonight. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Right, excellent. Thank you, Dr. Grzeskowiak. That was fascinating, and you touched on so many of the points that I was jotting down some potential questions, and you thought about them before I even jotted them down. So thanks so much for really thorough and fascinating presentation. I'm going to open up the questions here and start going through some of these. The question about whether such devices might be compatible with existing neurostimulation devices like the VNS, any indication as to whether there would be any contraindication for someone using or who already has a neurostimulation device using a seizure forecasting device, or any possibility for neurostimulation devices and seizure forecasting devices kind of working together?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, actually, because when we think about what studies are currently being conducted, even in the My Seizure Gauge initiative, that's really the way that that we collect that data, and that's the data that's really available right now for the research community. So in terms of the question about, well, if you're using a neurostimulator device, right, and then you detect a seizure, is that going to affect your forecast? It's a great question. I don't think the forecasting community has put those together yet, in terms of, you know, making sure that the seizure detections, whether or not they say interfere with the ability to forecast. I think that's to be determined. But I would say that, you know, sometimes the stimulator devices are really good at, you know, over, I would say for a lot of people over years, being able to reduce seizure frequency. So there's certainly the possibility that, you know, you have more false positives in that sense of, you know, the seizure forecast may say you're likely to have a seizure, but your neurostimulator device kind of kicks in, and then you don't have a seizure. That's possible. But I think, you know, when people start to actually get a FDA approval and use these tools in a way that is more regulated, then we'll be able to really assess. And I'm sure that's going to be a very important criteria when you know, the regulatory approval happens, to be considered as they work through seizure forecasting tools.
Right, right. And kind of as a follow-up to that question, if someone is getting information saying that they're high likelihood for a seizure, what are the chances that that can then be used, that the epileptologist or neurologist could be notified and then could advise in terms of taking a benzodiazepine, or in terms of adjusting the VNS settings or something along those lines, so actually being able to clinically intervene to further lower the likelihood of a seizure if the prediction is that you're at high risk.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a really excellent and well put way of saying that that is really what the future is, right? Is is personalized to the patient. And so that interaction, which you just outlined, I think that's exactly what the goal is for each paper that I read about seizure forecasting, really. Like, that's the vision, is that, you know, you get the information, and that's why seizure detection is such an important place to start. You get that information, and that's really what allows you to have interventions. And whether that's your epileptologist or whether that's some kind of medication intervention, as I outlined in that one NeuroVista patient who could actually use the forecasting device for knowing when to take medication. There's, you know, that is ultimately what will give people predictability in knowing when to take anti-seizure medication.
Okay, great. And another person wants to know if the forecasting will also be valid in conditions that are known to change seizure pattern very frequently, or change intensity very frequently, such as CDKL5 mutation and Dravet syndrome. So like in those epilepsy syndromes, rare epilepsy syndromes, where patterns are, you know, probably harder to predict, do you anticipate that that will be more challenging for these devices to work, or will that be, you know, I guess, taken into account during the development?
Yeah, so that's a really critical component that the community needs to work on, I would say. So as I mentioned, most of the data that we have come from focal seizures in adults, because that's really who's getting implanted with the devices that we can use to really track on a large scale. But what I would say to that is, you know, as we continue to get more and more data and information and implant additional people with devices and collect their data, you know, the time frames in which we collect data, the more we get, I think the more we'll be able to determine if patterns exist. And, you know, if patterns don't exist just from things like what we call circadian rhythm, which is like a daily pattern, or even like the weekly or monthly patterns that I showed, there might be like yearly patterns or even other biomarkers that are going to be important for predicting seizures. And so certainly those rhythmic patterns that I mentioned, those are not exclusively what people use to forecast seizures. And as we think about additional biomarkers, which might be possible, like I mentioned, there are some changes in sweat that might be a factor in, you know, right before you have a seizure, there might be some chemical changes that happen that allow you to determine that a seizure is going to occur. Those kinds of studies will provide additional information that might be useful for people to predict other kinds of epilepsies that don't have those more, you know, pattern or rhythmic seizure patterns.
Okay. And we have a few questions kind of talking about different types of seizures. It sounds like maybe this was, you mentioned it's looking at older or at adults with focal epilepsies. So is that looking at specifically focal impaired awareness seizures, or the full range of focal seizures that are common in adults with focal epilepsies, including focal aware, focal impaired, and the focal to bilateral tonic-clonic seizures?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, there is a spectrum that's incorporated into the data sets. For example, the tonic-clonic detection is really accurate even on wearables today. I mean, you can download apps that can use the accelerometer on your, you know, watch, for example, or there's devices that can measure if you're having nocturnal seizures, for example, that can measure that through algorithms using a camera system over the bed. So there's definitely different options for different seizure types within focal epilepsy, but beyond that, there's really limited options, unfortunately, today. But it does include multiple types of seizures.
Okay. So as far as current seizure detection devices, another person asked about whether it can detect those that don't involve convulsive movements, and currently really there are no devices that can. As far as the eventual goal with seizure forecasting devices, is it possible that the device may be able to say you are at high risk for focal aware seizure, but low risk for tonic-clonic, or would it be able to even differentiate in terms of risk for particular seizure types? Because someone who's at high risk for an absent seizure, but low risk for a tonic-clonic seizure may continue to go out and do whatever they were planning for that day.
Yeah, no, that's such a great question. I love that question because it really gets to the point of, the answer is, I would say it's not possible today, but what's great is that as we accumulate many different kinds of data, we can use and incorporate all of that to tell us more information on a personal scale. So it's really going to have to be a very precision medicine approach to sharing that information. So it all depends on what information goes into the ultimate system. So the seizure forecasting tool or device, along with all of the other components and, medical history that includes types of seizures and all of that. So, if you keep your seizure diary, for example, the My Seizure Diary, and you can, you can pick when you log seizures, what kind of seizures you have, that kind of information ultimately would be able to tell you, not at least detection wise, the kinds of seizures that you're having, but ultimately if you could delineate that in a seizure forecasting tool, that would be a very advanced part of seizure forecasting. And while I think at this point we're not to that granular of a level, I think that is a really it's a great goal for the forecasting community to achieve, which is not. And when we start to think about the deep learning and all of the artificial intelligence, feeding that kind of data into that system, that's really what the granular level of possibility is. But I would say right now we have, we're really not at that level today.
Right. So would there be capability presumably for these devices to record the information for further analysis and fine tuning, so that, someone could look at a month's data and be able to say, well, it looks like, it's been missing these seizures, but detecting these ones or predicting these ones and missing these other ones.
Mm-hmm.
I know the NeuroPace, for example, does that. So would something similar be available for this?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's really what, again, the artificial intelligence can really help with, is just that learning capability from the individual. So that person can get that feedback, like the Pandora radio, right? Like you can just thumbs up or thumbs down. Like if the device is saying, oh, you're in a seizure safe time, but then you have a seizure, well, you're gonna rate that right down, right? And so then what it's gonna do is the artificial intelligence can get fed back and say, oh, that didn't work. Why didn't that work? What are the other components of the data that's being collected that didn't get captured there? But I think the other thing you're hitting on, which is really important, is being able to deliver that information back to the person, right? So having the ability to look back and say, over the past month, what did my seizure detection do, and was it accurate? And being able to have your own insights kind of displayed for you is also really important, so that you can take that information and decide if it's useful for you or not.
Okay, so and just for clarification, in terms of the AI component and the ability to kind of learn based on data that's provided and feedback, I imagine that can happen with getting data from thousands of people using the device on that scale, but can it also provide individualized changes to how the device works based on your individual feedback? And is the AI Like, is that in the cloud or is that more in the device itself? It seems like you kind of need a pretty powerful computer to do that. So can you just kind of clarify how that works?
Sure, absolutely. It's a great clarifying question, because it's a very the way that the ability for devices like your Apple Watch to be able to, for example, now it can look at your heart rate over time and kind of warn you if you are in a state where you're likely to have, if you're prone to having particular like heart arrhythmia or something like that. Those kinds of AI that's been developed to feed that algorithm, it's all developed in a cloud. It's not on a local device, which is what allows it to have that computing power. But it does go back to this question of how much can an individual tell you versus how much can everyone's data tell you. And the key there is with deep learning is really that the system trains itself over time. So while we need a very large critical mass of data from many people, from many seizure types, from many different patterns of seizures, the goal is that when you train the data set on those seizure types, that's really where the machine learns those particular patterns. And then what it does is it applies that to an individual and then can adjust based on that, based on feedback from the individual. So the answer is kind of both, but I'd say starting point is collecting all of that critical mass of data. And that is no small feat. It is a very, the more data and the higher quality data you have, the more information and the longer recordings you have too, by the way, which is, some people look at, 10 years of EEG data in order to really be able to predict that. And so it's not to say that for every person you'll have, a 3-month period where they detect seizures and then everybody gets able to have this prediction tool. But for some people, they will be able to use this. For those people, their seizures might even be obvious in terms of patterns just from logging it through, say, a seizure diary to start with. And then as we learn and validate in people who have very common patterns that are easily predictable, then you can continue to kind of build out the data set and get into more complex cases.
Okay, great. Another person asked about whether these types of devices would work for those who have a seizure focus deep within the brain, such as the insula. I imagine that's going to be another one of those areas where some people are going to be more likely to benefit from others. And if it's dependent on EEG data, areas of the brain that are where it's harder to detect seizures with an EEG, such as the deeper parts of the brain, might be less effective in those people. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that that's right. I mean, I would say that, what I've presented here is a lot of kind of EEG gold standard type of stuff. But, as the community evolves and we find additional ways to accurately detect seizures through other, other sensors, and validate that, I think there will be additional possibilities. But for now, I would agree that, there are limitations on the way that we train the data is through looking at EEG data. And so that's going to be a limitation for sure. And, might delay a particular people who have trouble with accurately recording seizures through EEGs.
Okay. And presumably the research that's going into this is that largely geared towards adults at this time, or is there any data being obtained from children?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because of the, well, I can speak specifically for my Seizure Gauge initiative, which is all adults. There are, I'm not aware of studies that are looking at forecasting for children at the moment. But I think there's, there's sort of different tiers of how we want to get this information. And it's a little bit counterintuitive, because as you think about who needs the devices, and you think about, you know, a caregiver or a parent who's trying to, you know, plan their child going to school and how that would impact their day, you know, there is a need for that. And not to say that it won't be possible, but if we start with the people who have very routine patterns and very easily implantable devices where we can track them, and, you know, use that as a starting point to, you know, begin to understand these patterns and predictions, we can, again, grow it out over time. And so that's really the goal. But for now, you know, the Seizure Gauge initiative is focused on adults, with the hope of, you know, eventually extrapolating down to, you know, to pediatrics.
Sure. Here's a tough question. Any idea on when this might be available? If you had to guess, ballpark it.
Yeah.
Roughly.
Well, again, and that depends on who you are, because like I said, there's, you know, the device is going to be useful for a subset of people sooner than others. And I say a device, you know, there's multiple things in development, sure. And there's a lot of interest in the space right now. So it's a really, it's a very robust research initiative at the moment. So I have faith that there will be something soon. I would say, for example, the Seizure team that we work with on the My Seizure Gauge initiative, they, I think maybe even as close as next year, because that was really the goal of our whole initiative, was to have something that, you know, at least an initial prototype within 3 years. We're kind of trying to hold them to that and say, let's get something that works out there. And so they've been testing and training data sets, and I think they will have, you know, something that may be available by the end of next year. And then there's also, you know, other people who are working on other things. The You Helpline team is a group out of Israel who has a wearable that can tell you an hour before you're about to have a seizure. And so they're working on getting that available commercially too. So I would say that there's people who are super close. And again, you know, maybe next year I'll be able to come back and share some different examples with you, success stories. So that is the goal.
So a couple more questions about the type of data that people would provide for these devices, and one specifically asking about those who are nonverbal, and maybe who may not be able to explain how they're feeling, or those types of things that could be valuable information. Like do you envision a device where you would type something into your smartphone at the beginning of each day saying, how are you feeling today on a scale of 1 to 10, or just a simple set of 1 or 2 questions that could provide that kind of subjective data that might be just as useful as the more objective data? Is that something that would be involved in these devices?
Yes, so that is a very good question, and it is very important that we continue to collect information and feedback from people, just like what you mentioned. So there, even within the Seizure group, I think we've all kind of looked at the data and understood that when people have, you know, mood changes or other emotional changes, there can be really important data collected from that. And so there's absolutely a need for that. And that is something that can be incorporated into a seizure forecasting tool, or even just, you know, logging seizures so that you understand yourself better when you're, you know, in a time where you're likely to have a seizure.
Okay, and then the data that would be monitored, would that be presumably stored in the cloud or uploaded regularly to the cloud as opposed to stored in the device itself?
Yeah, you know, the question really And it'll be interesting to see what is a standalone device versus something that's just maybe right on your smartphone, to answer that question. So I think that, you know, a lot of people have, you know, things like where they expect a device that can output information right into their app, say. So if you have like a Fitbit, you know, you can count your steps and then you see the result, you know, kind of on your phone in terms of how many steps you took. And maybe you can also see how many steps you're taking each day when you are wearing the device. So I think it's possible to have a spectrum of options in that case, which is that, you know, for some people, and actually for a subset of people who keep seizure diaries, that might be all that they need, is the input from a seizure diary to be able to predict their seizures. And so in that case, you really don't need more than a you know, a smartphone to be able to forecast your seizure. And then in other cases, you might actually have additional biosensors, as I mentioned. So I think that as products enter the market, there's probably going to be a spectrum of options in the next, you know, say 5-10 years.
Okay, and one more quick question is because NeuroPace has just this vast amount of patient data from their devices, have they been involved in this area of research as well, and sharing some of that data or anything along those lines?
Yeah, so I definitely do think that they are doing research in seizure forecasting. They obviously, I mean, for example, the My Seizure Gauge team can use some of the NeuroPace data that's publicly available, right? But there's obviously limitations of that factor into, you know, kind of proprietary tools that NeuroPace is using.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think that is exactly right. That in general, I'd say, you know, there has to be support from everyone to use these the data sets from this for the good of the research community. And by and large, I think a lot of research questions that use NeuroPace and have those as part of their research cohorts get that kind of data, and at least you can extrapolate it too from some of the outputs that you get from a NeuroPace device from like in a clinical setting, and you're able to kind of, you know, use those output readings to go back in and drill in on some of that. And so people do that research. It's a little bit, you know, an extra layer, an extra step, but it's possible, and it's important that people consider that since it's very fruitful data that's being collected.
Great, great. Well, thank you so much. We got through a lot of good questions and kind of close out the evening, but thank you so much for a fascinating discussion, and certainly provides a lot of optimism for us all. So
thank you so much.